Okay, so this is the Slovenian pleasure retreat. We're on day 2. We've been doing some body work, some dance, hopefully like me having some great food, looking out the window at the beautiful nature. Yeah. When you like see the word pleasure, or say it in your first language, say pleasure in Slovenian. A couple more times. Okay, what's your response in your body? Who's like, yay?
Fuck yes.
Fuck yes.
Okay, so we have fuck yeah, that's an embodiment. Okay, we have yeah. We have because actually there's a couple different relationships people have, and you're probably a mix. And if we looked at the type of pleasure, we might have different responses. Yeah. Also, you're an embodiment crowd, so you're probably more like fuck yeah than the average person. Embodiment people tend to be quite pleasure orientated because you're body orientated as they go together. Yeah. So a culture, I would say, is a decadent culture. So decadent cultures are a little bit pleasure obsessed, actually, and a particular type of pleasure. We're going to differentiate some types of pleasure following on from yesterday. Why is it pleasure obsessed? Because it doesn't have any meaning. So decadent cultures have lost their meaning. They're not really religious. They don't have a strong civic meaning like the Greeks might have had, for example. They had, what is it to be a Greek citizen? Greeks would ask, what is it to be a noble Greek citizen? If you ask someone like, what is it to be a noble British citizen? They'd be like, what the fuck are you on about? Right? That would just be a strange question to most British people. We're pretty secular in the UK. I think maybe Slovenia a bit less. I know one of you is Czech, which is the most secular country in Europe, I hear. Estonia, I was just in, is pretty secular. So there isn't necessarily a religious meaning, So because the values are a bit lost, and really it's kind of like this consumer wasteland in some ways, what replaces meaning and purpose for people is pleasure. So it's like, okay, life is tough, right? Like, even if you're in Western society that has central heating and cappuccinos and blowjobs and all these good things, you still have suffering. I was talking about childbirth with someone today. They're like, it hurts. Yeah. You still have the death of parents, best case scenario. You still have illness, right? Like I'm in my 40s, I start to have a few little illnesses, little injuries, little aches and pains. Even though I'm doing yoga and meditation, the Buddhists would say, like, there's no escaping suffering. There's old age, illness, and death. There's just no getting out of it. So given the affront, the challenge of life having suffering in, we either have to make it meaningful, or in the absence, like why is we're talking about childbirth with someone this morning? Okay, I'm not an expert, just to be clear, but meaningful pain is different from meaningless pain. Is that fair to say? Yeah, people have had babies. Maybe you could tell me if I'm full of shit. Yeah, some nodding going on from Lucia. Okay, yeah, great. It's my specialist topic. Yeah. Okay, so meaning is one way to deal with pain. At least the pain becomes meaningful. Another way is simply to medicate ourselves, and that could be very literally, like we are living in the most medicated culture ever, all right? Alcohol, TV, it could be something that numbs you, or it's something that just gives you a kind of cheap, quick thrill, the porn, the sugary food, or whatever it is. So this is, an attempt to cope. Look at Gabor Mate's work on addiction. It's a way to cope. It's a way to cope, So it's not so much like judging, you awful, hedonistic, decadent, degenerate people. Yeah, it's like, no, you're just trying to deal with the fact that life is hard and we live in a culture that doesn't imbue it with significant meaning. Okay? So of course we can find our own meaning, but it becomes a sort of individual hero's journey. I feel like my own life, I found purpose. It's interesting, I used to be an alcoholic, right? And doing lots of martial arts gave me willpower, which again is missing in a decadent culture. And that was great, and that would keep me sober for up to 2 or 3 weeks. That was like my record. Because willpower is useful, to get in the cold shower, to resist the food, to be faithful to your partner, whatever you need willpower for. Yeah. However, it's a limited resource, actually. And it wasn't until I found life purpose, number 2, that I was able to get sober. So the Aikido, the martial arts really helped. Like I had and people always used to say to me, you're so disciplined, even when I was alcoholic. I was like, really? Because compared to them, I was. Compared to a samurai, not so much. Right? Compared to an ancient Greek, not so much. Yeah, but I had more discipline than the average sort of degenerate, person in their early 20s in our culture. Yeah. It wasn't until I got life purpose that I had a reason to stay sober. It was like, okay, for me, it was embodiment, that shifted in different ways over the years, different projects I've done. But now I have meaning. It's like, right, like I remember when I did the Ukraine project last year, I was like, I had a reason to go to bed early. I had a reason to get up and meditate. I had a reason to eat well, even more than normal. It was like, everything orientates to meaning, Got shivers up my spine when I even talk about it. It's like, ooh, you feel that? Yeah. Third one that really helped me stay sober was community. So do you notice, maybe you've heard of AA or NA, these groups. So they work with ritual and they work with community. There's a little bit of self-regulation. You might learn meditation or prayer or something like this. But mostly what it is peer support, right? You mentor people. There's different aspects of peer support, but it's community. So community is another aspect that's broken down in a decadent culture because we don't believe in the same things, so therefore we don't really have a coherent community. Actually, Slovenia is a bit better than some countries. Actually, I find it's not such a bad place for this. Not the worst by far. Because we're not in community, we're not what psychologists would call co-regulated. So because we're not co-regulated, what do we need more of? Pleasure again, right? Because we're lacking. Have you noticed that when you're with your friends having a really nice time, you don't want to keep checking your phone?
Yeah.
You notice that? You're like,
yeah.
Oh, you're in a really meaningful community. Like I think we're forming one here on this training, it's a small one. You're like, suddenly I'm eating better. I'm not eating so much shit last night. I'm not eating a tub of ice cream. I'm hanging out with Mira. I've got friendship. I've got good colleagues like Ava. I'm catching up with Lawrence. And all of a sudden, it's like I'm not eating shit again. My sugar addiction's gone. Right? This wasn't willpower. This was co-regulation. So the lack of co-regulation. So the way in which because we're social animals, we calm each other down. Or sometimes upregulate each other too. So co-regulation shits on self-regulation. But if you don't have co-regulation, you have to self-regulate. And the quick, easy way to do that, if you don't have skill, like martial arts or yoga or meditation, is just like addictive substances. Because they give you a short-term release, at least. A definition of addictive substance, it's a short-term solution that makes the problem it solves worse. So think about that. So it's a short-term solution that makes the problem it's solving worse. So you drink alcohol, you feel really good, but then the next day you're depressed. So this is a kind of pleasure we should fear, to use a Buddhist phrase. Buddhists, I said yesterday, talk about pleasures to fear and pleasures not to fear. So a pleasure to fear, or let's say to be cautious of, would be one that gives us less pleasure ultimately. So one way of looking at pleasure, actually I'll come to that in a minute. So the other one that we're looking at, so we've got self-regulation, co-regulation, we can get more skilled at self-regulation. That's what they call discipline. Discipline is also purpose. It's remembering what you love. So the Stoics had this, right? The Stoics would say, every day ask what's the most important thing. So that's bringing your values to the fore. But did you ever find yourself arguing on Facebook and then you go, does this really matter? No, it's just bullshit. And you realize that you re-bring your values, and we can actually do centering around values. Like right now, listening to this talk, and on the internet, hello, future humans in spandex on the internet, you can actually ask yourself, why does this matter to me? Like, why does this matter? Like, I'm telling you about pleasure, but hopefully you're connecting it to your children, to your work, to what you love, right? Your religion, whatever you love. If you're not, you're bored, right? So I highly advise you don't get bored. So boredom is actually kind of decadent emotion. Imagine like a prehistoric person in a cave fighting off tigers being bored. Like, I'm so bored. Like cynicism is another one, right? Like, oh my God. Like, imagine like a hipster caveman. Like, oh yeah, I don't even kill tigers. That's so last year. You know what I mean? Like it's ridiculous, right? You know what's decadent. You don't have to. I've studied history, right? Like, history is my hobby, right? So I've studied Rome and China. Even the Incas had decadence. It's not a Western thing. It's cross-cultural decadence. But you don't have to study history, though. You know the flavor of decadence. You see, like, imagine you walk in and you're like 15-year-olds like jerking off to porn. Okay? At no point you go, what a healthy, wholesome activity. Carry on, young man. You go, it's kind of gross, right? Now, if you walked in on your 15-year-old, making love with his first girlfriend and they were deeply in love, you might still be like a bit like, okay, I don't want to see that. But you'd be like, oh, good for them. Throw some condoms and, get on with the day. You know what I mean? It's like, you would understand that. That's an instinctive thing. It's the same difference between a good meal and fast food. Right? Like, I was lucky enough to be cooked a good meal yesterday. Spiritual food for me, steak and chips okay, with a sneaky salad to make sure I had some healthy shit, green shit next to it. And, it's nourishing to have that kind of meal, particularly if you have it with a friend, it's nourishing. Yeah, it's nourishing. And you feel that nourishment. You don't go, oh, I should be careful of this. Right? Whereas, I used to be a drug addict, when you take drugs, that's great. But part of you is going, red flag. Part of you is ringing a bell saying, be careful. I actually tried Red Bull for the first time this year. I stole one of my wife's Red Bulls and immediately went, oh, I like that. And I knew I was going to be addicted to it within a week. Right? 2 weeks later, I'm on 5 a day. I had to fucking quit my habit, You know what I mean? You feel it. You know what a shitty kebab tastes like. You know what kebab sex tastes like. Anyone ever had kebab sex? This way, some Tinder hookup or you fucking your ex you shouldn't fuck where there's no love, It's don't do that. But because you have an embodied sense we could call a conscience. Sometimes in the West, the conscience is like a little angel or something, right? I don't think it's over here. It's here. It's yuck. It's an aesthetic feeling as well as a moral feeling, right? That kebab, aesthetically, you're it's greasy. It's ick. You can, it's in your body, assuming you're in your body, and if you're in a decadent society, you won't be, you will feel the ick. Do you know what I mean by ick? The yuck. It comes with regret. And I don't think that regret's just shaming. It's not guilt. You know what I mean? It's not you had really religious parents, you've been told sex is bad, you should feel bad. Though that's still in our culture. So our culture has a weird relationship to pleasure, because on the one hand, we're addicted to hedonism as a way to survive the lack of community, the lack of meaning, to survive the nihilism. We're addicted to pleasure. But on the other hand, there's still this Calvinistic feel in pleasure. There's still a little bit of Christian hangover. You know what I mean? It's why kinky sex feels good, because it's naughty. You know what I mean? There's that little bit of now some of you are a bit Italian, we're close to Italy here, you're what are you talking about? Pleasure is good. But some of us have that little bit of Catholic guilt. That little bit of enjoy yourself, but not too much. Yeah, so if I say yes, say yes. Yes. Da, yeah. Say it you really mean it. Da. So it's still could be more, right? Yes! So you see the laughs? You laugh because it's slightly embarrassing. Some of you didn't laugh. Some of you were yeah, that's how I orgasm. I remember the first time I had a girlfriend when I lived in Brazil, and I saw her eating a mango, and my mother was visiting, right? And the juice was just dripping down her, and she was groaning, and she was oh, mame the maqui. She was called my mum, it's Brazilian, Portuguese, and she'd be oh, you have to try this mango. And I'm sitting there, and I'm oh my God, I've never felt so English. She was enjoying a mango more than some English girls enjoy an orgasm. She was really, I thought I was pretty liberated. I've come from a pretty liberal family. We always enjoyed food, but I never saw someone enjoy a mango like that before. This was oh, that's enjoying a mango. I thought, I was yum, very tasty. So you see, there's still that little bit of residual, Catholic or Calvinist or Christian guilt. There's that little bit of, the pagans were probably having some fucking in the fields for fertility, and then some priest came along and said, stop it. Missionary position only, right? Don't enjoy yourselves too much now. That's the way of the devil. So we still have a little bit of this in our culture. So it's very interesting when we're in a decadent culture, because on the one hand, we have one trap, which is kind of hedonism, right? Keep pursuing pleasure. Trust me, I know where that leads. I've done the experiment. I've lived above the nightclub in Brazil. I've been a drug addict, okay? It's I've fucked so much that my HIV tests should really be coming up positive, and the fact that they don't is a sign of injustice, right? I've done that experiment. If you don't believe me, you could try it. You might die. That's the disadvantage of that experiment, okay? But it didn't lead me to happiness. Okay. So what do? So the Calvinistic way, that's not really going to work, right? Just deny pleasure, repress it. It's not really going to work. But if we fully go into hedonistic pleasure, that doesn't work so well either. So first of all, I'd say we need to learn to differentiate in our bodies wholesome pleasure, from addictive pleasure. Okay, we need to feel the difference between a pleasure that it gives and a pleasure that takes. Okay, so a pleasure that's nourishing versus a pleasure that's addictive. And you can feel the difference, right? If you've done a bit of embodiment, way easier. Okay, so if I look at the beauty of Lake Bled in Slovenia, right? It's a beautiful, beautiful view. I don't feel like it's taking from me. It's not draining my soul, it's enhancing it, right? Like I come here, I feel nourished, I feel well. It doesn't tire me out, you know? Now, I could still get grasping, so this is the kind of Buddhist take on this. We're going to play with this experientially after this talk. I can still go, but I want that. Now, it's as soon as you add mine, you have a problem, right? It's like, oh, look at that beautiful child, and I want them to be like how I want them to be. Now you have a problem. Yeah? So we can get attached even to wholesome things. So we have wholesome, unwholesome. That's the first distinction. So wholesome or nourishing. Wholesome versus, we could say addictive or shallow would be another way of saying it. Yeah. In Buddhist, we talk about spiritual versus sensual. I think that's one way to discuss it. So, for example, being generous. Giving is a pleasure. Who's been there at Christmas or whatever you celebrate when someone's opening a present that you bought? Oh, it's so much fun, isn't it? You're like, oh, you're gonna love this. It's a cat thing, and you love cats. You know, you're like, the pleasure of giving. Okay, so that's a deep pleasure. Yeah, there's also a pleasure in non-attachment. Who's ever given up an addiction? Like my Red Bull addiction, right? I've given up like 10. Yeah, every year there's a new one. Facebook, whatever. Fucking. There's a pleasure in giving up an addiction because what comes is freedom. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's like kind of smug. You're like, I don't smoke cigarettes anymore. Yeah. Ex-smokers are the fucking worst, aren't they? Assholes. You know, because they're like, I used to be addictive, and they're being an ass about it. But the pleasure they're feeling is like a pride in liberation. You know what I mean? Like, and I actually get respect. I've been sober for 17 years, I think now. And people respect that when if someone's a year in, be careful. If someone's like 5 years or more sober, I'd say that's to be respected, right? You're like, hey, you stopped doing something that was killing you. Now, that's just common sense in one way. It's like, well done, you know, like good for you. Like I also don't punch myself in the head, you know. But on the other hand, there's this feeling of like, well, actually, that's to be respected because we understand in some way it's noble. It's not a very postmodern word. In our cynical word, like what's noble? It's noble to give up an addiction, right? We respect that. And there's a pleasure in it. For me, there's a freedom in going into a bar and going, you know, like I remember my cousin's marriage. He said, oh, can you buy me a drink from the bar? And he said, buy me a Stella. Now that was the beer I used to drink. And I bought a Stella and everyone was buying him drinks because he was getting married, right? And I held it in my hand and didn't want it. It wasn't like I was there going, oh my God, I'm using my willpower. It's like I just didn't want it. And then after 10 minutes, I gave it to him. And the feeling of just like, this no longer is a trap for me. Now, in my first year of sobriety, that would have been a bad idea, right? This was like 10 years in, you know? So there's the enjoyment of the freedom of not being addicted. So all addictions are not enjoyable. If someone says to me, do I have a problem with alcohol? Who's our wine girl? You know? If someone says to me, do I have a problem with alcohol? I'm like, do you still enjoy it? If you enjoy it, enjoy it. You know, like I have friends that get drunk, I have friends that drink wine, whatever. Do you enjoy it? If you don't enjoy it though, maybe it's time to quit. Yeah? Also, the other test is, do you have freedom over it? So someone says to me, am I an alcoholic? I get this question quite a lot because I'm fairly public about being sober long term. I say two things. Like one, is it ruining other things you care about? So when pleasure becomes a problem for your values, it ruins, shallow pleasure is ruining deeper pleasure. Right? Like if you're a junkie and you're stealing off your mother to support your heroin habit, that's ruining the pleasure of family. That's ruining the pleasure of honesty. That's a deeper pleasure. So a travesty is when you sacrifice something bigger for something smaller. Right? A sacrifice is where you you get rid of something smaller for something bigger. You say, hey, I'd love to fuck everyone, but actually monogamy for me is more satisfying. Yeah? Or hey, I'd love to eat shit all the time, but actually being healthy is more satisfying. So a sacrifice is this idea of we take something that's less, ultimately, long term or even medium term, more pleasurable. So we give something up that's small for something big. Right? Like I might enjoy smoking a cigarette, but I'm going to enjoy living long enough to see my grandchildren more. Right? So we're sacrificing something. Yeah, and it's not like, oh, I have to sacrifice, I have to give up the pleasure. It's no, I'm choosing the bigger pleasure. So what I'm suggesting as an antidote to decadence is not less pleasure. Okay, what I'm selling you here is more pleasure. Okay, I'm selling you better pleasure. All right, if I'm like, oh, you have to give up cake, you're like, fuck you, life is hard, I want cake. Like, I like cake, Mira's cake's great. Okay, but if I said, you know what, there's this pleasure that's small, and if you give that up, you get this much bigger thing, that's a good deal. Yeah. So in a way, what we could call discipline, renunciation is part of this. Renunciation resets the system, right? So like, have a week of sex, afterwards you enjoy it more. Okay, have a week of eating simple food, afterwards you enjoy the cake more. Renunciation is one of the answers because it resets the whole, just chemically, the whole dopamine reward system. Yeah, have a cold shower, then you feel good not being in the cold shower. Oh, by the way, pleasure's relative. So if something good gets taken away, that's painful. But if something painful gets taken away, neutral becomes good, right? So we need to deliberately make ourselves physically uncomfortable because in a decadent world, that's missing. Like, you know, I remember I lived in Ethiopia for a while and it was pretty rough and there was always something biting you and the sun was always too hot and there was always dust. And I remember I'd come back to my mother's house in England afterwards and I sat in the armchair and I had this weird feeling and it was deeply ecstatic. And that feeling was nothing was eating me, nothing was burning me. I had enough food to eat in my stomach. I was comfortable. And comfort was like, this is Western civilization, right? Like none of you are starving. Like, me neither, you can tell, right? Like we're not really suffering like burning from the sun too often. You know, I got burned in the shower yesterday by mistake, but this is pretty rare. You know what I mean? It's not accidentally hit the hot water on in the shower. But even this, I could have gone to hospital. Like we're a pretty comfortable situation. Yeah, even if we're poor, it's comfortable compared to Ethiopia. It's comfortable compared to my grandfather in Ireland 100 years ago. You know? So because we have so much comfort, we need to deliberately give ourselves discomfort. So cold showers, weight training, breath work, yoga, whatever it is, to reset that hedonistic system. Or else we just have what's called the hedonistic treadmill? Hedonic treadmill. Yeah? So we just get used to things being nice. So you can reset that, for example, by fasting. By having a period of abstinence, by having a period of celibacy. Yeah? I managed 3 days once. It's amazing. You see? So this is going to be relative to your drives, right? It's going to be relative to your drives. I lived in a monastery for 25 days. It wasn't hard at all. Well, this was hard, but the actual doing of it was not hard. In a monastery, it's easy. There's no temptation. It's just... Yeah. It's difficult in a modern decadent culture because there's adverts everywhere. I remember once, like I was on the London Underground and there was a Wonder Bra advert. There were breasts like this big, just right in front of me. And I was like, I love breasts, but I don't want to see them all the time. Like I'm trying to think about work. You know what I mean? Like why are they right here in my face? In a monastery, you don't have that. You don't have someone saying, hey, how about a Red Bull? How about some cigarettes? How about some alcohol? You're just in a monastery. Yeah. So our culture makes this difficult. Again, this is where community comes in. So I tend to be in communities that aren't like excessively druggy or alcoholic or whatever. I don't want to be around that. I can, but I don't want to be. Yeah. Okay, so we have eco-regulation. That helps, right? Nature's a big part of being regulated. So we're less addictive if we're in nature. There's a whole ecotherapy movement. Co-regulation, including touch, including movement, including things we do together. Yeah. And we get better at self-regulation because even though that's the least effective, it's the one we can most rely on. You can't always get a hug, you can't always do a breath technique, okay? If you have those things, you're much less likely to need addictive pleasures and you're more likely to notice wholesome pleasures, okay? To notice the difference, to enjoy it, and then you get virtuous cycles. So the more you do wholesome things, the more that kebab's like yuck, yeah? Like, stay at a Buddhist monastery for a week and then try looking at porn. You're just like, yeah. Feels off, right? So we can get used to hedonistic addictive pleasures and we can get used to wholesome pleasures and it resets your sort of midpoint. Yeah? Make sense? Okay, so what do we do to enjoy pleasure? 1, we have some periods of renunciation. 2, we learn to differentiate at the wholesome versus shallow, and then we have renunciation, and we could sort of / challenge would be the thing here, like You know, you do the weightlifting, life's really hard, then afterwards you feel really good, you go for the sauna and it's easy. Yeah, or you make the sauna really hot, you have the ice bath really cold. Yeah, so you're kind of resetting that sense of ease. You're also building in challenge, this is almost maybe a third one, it's kind of like skill. Discipline is a skill. Discipline is also the skill of discipline, and then we have the values reconnection of discipline. So it's kind of two things, not really one. So purpose, eco, yeah, co, these are all things we need to do. We need community, we need purpose, we need some basic skill sets. They're not rocket science, like you can learn centering pretty quick. Yeah. Good, makes sense? Any questions? I just told you how to have a nice life. Like, how to enjoy yourself. It's interesting, right? We do so much for pleasure. If you think about it, why do people buy a nice car? Why do people buy a Ferrari? Because they want pleasure. Maybe the pleasure of someone saying, oh, a nice car. Why do people get a beautiful husband? Why do people do anything? It's because of this. And what I'm teaching you to do in some ways is to just A, do it effectively, and B, to cut out the middleman. Yeah? So it's like, you know, it's all happening in your body. So if we work with the body, we're going straight to the end result. Okay? Again, that makes you less reliant upon, oh, you have to buy this to be pleasurable. You have to get these likes to be pleasurable, to have pleasure. You have to have this social status to get pleasure. Yeah? Yes?
I'm missing maybe one thing that comes to my mind. It's like, when I do all that stuff, the thing that I was missing usually is the time to honor it, you know? Like, stop, honor it, and kind of integrate it.
Yes.
Because yeah, I would do cold showers, sauna, blah blah blah, breathwork, and then, you know, after it, okay, I have this sense of I'm on, but I never actually stopped long enough to, okay, this is the pleasure that I'm feeling now, and move on.
Yeah, there's two things you remind me of, actually. Yeah, so great, thank you. One there is, where is it coming from? So if, like, I've got to have the cold showers, is coming from some Calvinistic feeling of self-punishment. It's not that motivator is going to ruin it, right? Like, you have to, you're a bad person if you don't. Like, wacha, wacha. Buddha said, if hate worked, I would teach you that. It's a freaking radical quote, actually, right? And that includes self-hate. Yeah? So if you're hating yourself into something healthy, you're actually taking away the health. You're undermining it. Second thing is, nourishment isn't just, it's the letting in. So earlier we were standing and looking out the window. You could just look at it and go, oh yeah, mountains. Right? But it's the letting it nourish you. And again, this is a key skill. It's like when someone gives you a compliment. What do most people do when you give them a compliment? They say, oh, that's nothing. Oh, you're cool too. They're just bouncing it off them, right? Like, just take that moment to go, yeah, I am fucking gorgeous, thank you. Right? Yeah, and then you are too, maybe. That 2 to 3 seconds, it doesn't take long. Or when you have the meal, it's like that, like, like letting it digest. So the absorption, the digestion, I think this is a really nice addition. Thank you. Any other ways you found helpful to enjoy pleasure rather than be hooked and addicted by it? What works for you?
Understand the question.
What in your life? So I could be full of shit, right? So in your life, it's possible. Yeah, never believe gurus on the internet. In your life, what has been effective in you actually enjoying pleasure as opposed to being hooked, being addicted? Because a fish sees a hook, right? And, pleasure. Yeah, it's hooked. It's a problem. So in your life, what's been effective?
Dancing.
Okay, so dancing, so movement. This is a pleasure not to be feared.
Family time.
Yeah. Family time. I would also say, like, for me, my niece and nephew, one of the most enjoyable things in my life. I talked about one of my mentors, Don Levine, yesterday. He said, in life, being a grandparent is one of the few things that's underrated.
Yeah.
And you can't kind of sell it, right? So why would a consumer society be pushing that?
Exactly.
Yeah, so we live in a world where certain pleasures can be monetized, and those pleasures will be pushed. Yeah, so Buddha talked about going against the stream. It's kind of radical to go against it. And even in his time it was there, but even more so in the time of Facebook and consumer food and blah, blah, blah. Food, that's what we eat, right? Food. Yeah. What else? So movement, pleasure not to be feared, family, I would say. You know, there's things we could get attached to in that, but it's but basically wholesome. Music, right? So again, you could get addicted to that. You might want to have a period of abstinence from music. Music's a little bit too everywhere in our culture. When you haven't heard music in a week and you hear music, it touches your soul.
Yeah.
When it's being piped out of every fucking cafe and restaurant, not so much.
Hobbies.
Yeah. Okay, so having some things you do just for fun that aren't not being productive, that aren't being paid for.
Yes.
Yeah.
The pleasure of doing something just for play. Yeah, it's an Italian one. The pleasure. We are close to Italy here. And again, we live in a society that's industrial, that's productive. You know, it's got that North European Calvinistic ethic, right?
Spending time in nature.
Okay, so nature. You don't ever go for a walk in the woods and you go, I really regret that. I feel disgusting now. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not a kebab, right? Sometimes I feel like, why am I teaching a class of this? You fucking know this.
Yes.
You know, by the time you're 21, you know this. Because you tried these things, right? But again, it's not your fault. We're living in a culture where you kind of have to medicate somehow, right? We're encouraged on every billboard, every advertisement. Yeah. Okay, good. Yes.
I have a problem
Yes.
to transition from like safety of my home to going to the woods. And this is like sometime, it's not a short time.
So it feels unsafe, or it is unsafe?
Yeah.
Is it dangerous in the woods, genuinely? I don't know where you live. So there's a feeling of not being okay there. Yeah, I mean, the woods always has two qualities. One is dark mystery and adventure, like bears live in the woods, right? Sometimes literally, sometimes more mythologically. Wolves live in the woods. So there's always this feeling like the woods is scary, yeah? And maybe there's a trauma history there, maybe it's just a particular sensitivity. The garden is one answer to that. So the garden is the civilized version of nature. Very English of me. I love a good garden. As I get older, Emily, I love a good National Trust garden. Lovely. Yeah. So the garden is like nature, but made safer. Okay. And the other thing is get a dog.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know anyone who walks in the woods with a dog and feels unsafe. So get a big dog. So good co-regulation, bit of touch. So that's another way to do it.
Best therapist.
Yeah. And also what we're looking at really is anything that's difficult for us, that is wholesome. We're using centering, okay, so this is a skill, we have a skill, and we're doing it gradually, right? Like, can you go for a walk in the woods for 1 minute, right? Yeah. So without digging too much into personal history, you know, we have some ways to handle this. Okay. All good? All right, I think we're up with the theory. Let's do some practice. If you're watching this on the internet, you don't get to do practice. You have to come to a workshop. So sorry.